Number one, you have to contain the virus and have a system of testing, tracing, and isolation so that an outbreak doesn't become a surge. And that containing of the virus means it can't be surging in places like Texas or California or Florida. That doesn't mean you can't reopen in a place like New York safely, but you're going to have to know that if there's this kind of surge that we have, that the schools might actually open and then close because the nation is really suffering from a resurgence of the virus. So you have to be able to tackle the virus and have very little community spread and that testing. Number two, you have to have a plan so that you stop the virus spread from inside a school. And that requires 6 things, all of which are based in science. Physical distancing of 6 feet, masks and other PPE, cleaning and ventilation. Yes, of course, washing hands and not touching your face. And last, making sure there's a reasonable accommodation for those who are at high risk. Some of that is really hard to do. Some of that is easier to do. But the third is that you have to have the resources to make that possible. If states have a 20% budget cut, how are they going to pay for the PPE that's needed for every single child and every single teacher every single day? How are they going to pay for the ventilation changes that are needed? How are they going to pay for the cleaning supplies? So when Congress and Mitch McConnell takes time off as opposed to negotiating that stimulus at the end of May, not closer to August, it says to the schools that the federal government doesn't care. And then on top of that, when the president just no plan, no resources, just being a COVID denier and says to everyone, I don't care that there's a crisis. We're reopening schools 5 days a week as if it was August 2019. He created a chaos that we didn't have beforehand. Yes, there was concern, but let me just give you a proof point. In the weeks before Trump's recklessness and DeVos's recklessness, we had polled our members about lots of things, and 76% of them, 3 out of 4 of them said, if we could get the safeguards that we were talking about, the 6 I talked to you about, masks and physical distancing and cleaning and ventilation, and obviously a reasonable accommodation for those at risk, in addition to washing hands, they were comfortable. 76% of them were comfortable going into schools because they know that remote education is not nearly as good, doesn't work as well, is only a substitute to, it's not a substitute for in-service learning. So it's a long way, Mark, of saying we want to, there's daunting obstacles, and if we can't make it safe, we will leave no stone unturned, leave nothing on the table to make sure that things are safe. Can't be safe in schools, then we have to go onto remote education. Hopefully, there will be places that will still be able to do hybrid, given the plans they're putting into place now and the resources, if we get the resources. But if we don't get the resources and the virus keeps surging, more and more places we're going to be on remote education.
And what you're describing in terms of resources and the ability to do that, that really boils down to county by county and city by city, doesn't it, Randy? I mean, some of these budget cuts are harsher in some places than others. I mean, it would have been nice too, I would add to that, knowing we were in the middle of a pandemic, if there had been a more uniform approach all over the country, right?
Yes, I mean, look, schooling is basically a local decision. And basically, schooling is based upon state constitutions, much more than the federal government. The federal government shouldn't be the school board. But at the end of the day, science is science. And there shouldn't have been just the CDC guidelines very quietly released. Guidelines that, by the way, are very much like, the guidelines we issued in April. They should have been issued months and months ago. But look what Betsy DeVos did. Nothing. Crickets about the guidance for how to reopen schools. No administration, at least since I've been around, in the last 30, 40 years, no administration has acted this haphazardly, this recklessly. The only guidance she put out was how to take money from poor kids in public schools and give it to private schools. Right. And so yes, there should have been a lot of guidance. There should have been a clearinghouse. There should have been, the Defense Production Act being used for PPE, testing, ventilation, all sorts of things. There's a huge role for the federal government here, both in that guidance and in providing the money, but that's making it much harder.
Yeah. And what is it with them? And I mean, that's a good point. They show a lot of bluster.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, but they show this bluster as if they really can call shots in local jurisdictions anyway, and we know they can't. But the attitude, Randi, was, we got to get these kids back in school. Kind of like when they say, people need to get back to work, as if adults or children are sloughing off, trying not to go to work or school. That's not the case at all. It's a pandemic. But it's like they have contempt for adults and parents. We've got to make sure you get these kids back in school. But they haven't lifted a finger, as you described, to make that happen.
I think there's I think there's three things that are going on right now,
okay,
all of which are despicable. Number one, Trump thinks he wins when he creates chaos and division. That's who he is, and that's why he should not be president. In a national emergency, you need national unity. You don't need people fighting with each other and creating more fear and creating more division. That's what he's doing in Portland right now. That's what he did here in downplaying the virus and doing all that. That's number one. Number two, they care about one thing. They care about getting reelected. And in their view, the only path to reelection is if in September and October, those economic numbers showed some promise. So I suspect that there was a conversation in the White House that said, oh, if public, they look at public schools as if it's childcare. And look, we have a custodial function, obviously, but they said, well, if those public schools don't reopen, how are more and more people going to go back to work? And how will we be able to have, an increase in GDP, and how will we be able to have those numbers going up? So I think it had everything to do with him wanting to figure out a lever to try to get a good political story or economic story for himself. And number three, Betsy DeVos has never, neither one of them ever talked about the importance of public schooling. Frankly, because of budget cuts, we've had 4-day school weeks in so many places in America, and I never heard them talk about how important it would be to get back to a 5-day school week and have the money to do that. They've cut federal funding year after year only to be replaced, thank God, because of Nancy Pelosi's House of Representatives and enough people in the Senate and the House that want public education. I think what she thought was, you create so much chaos, so much confusion, and then she'd blame the public schools and use it as a way to try to say, here, we need vouchers, we need privatization. So every one of these reasons was despicable. It had nothing to do with the best interest of children, with safety for parents, for teachers, for kids. It had everything to do with politics and with privatization and with chaos, all of which was despicable.
How are your members feeling? I'm sure everybody wants to get back in the classroom, but are people having a level of anxiety? Well, I guess in both cases, one going back and also doing things remotely, because that takes resources. Do
No,
we have the resources to
no,
even do this remotely effectively?
no. I mean, think about the digital divide. Think about the fact that, when the only thing kids have is a smartphone, and this happens to be, you know, a, a a pretty sophisticated smartphone. But you think if you're watching this all day long, that's going to be a decent education? We need to make sure, even if we're hybrid or remote, that we have to get kids access to the connectivity and to decent equipment. We need to actually have a lot more that was done this summer about, curriculum remotely. What do you do remotely? What do you do in hybrid? It's time to stop trying to make it up as we go along every single day. Even figuring out the safety protocols are hard enough, but we have a lot of learning protocols and well-being things that we have to do. So there is anxiety all over. I would say anxiety is the watchword right now. Teachers know that in school, in-person learning is very important, but they also know their buildings. So many of our schools are 50, 60, 100 years old. The windows don't open. Built schools that were built for, windowless or circular without good ventilation systems. How do you open them in a moment where ventilation is absolutely imperative because of the airborne nature of this? Schools are for social interaction. They're not, normally for social distancing. So there's a lot of anxiety about, will we be safe? Will our kids be safe? Will our educators be safe? And frankly, this notion that, kids, and thank God, really young kids haven't gotten really sick. That is a blessing.
Yeah.
But this notion that, because kids have not gotten very sick, that means that teachers can be and schools can be a petri dish. It's unconscionable. So that's why I'm saying people are very anxious. They're anxious because they don't have a plan. They're anxious because the resources aren't there. They're anxious because there's been a spike. Having said that, there are lots of places around the country where people are really trying to figure out a hybrid model and figure out how it could work. And that's because, teachers, our union leaders, superintendents, people understand the importance of schooling and in-school schooling for children.